back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be making a harpy. Now when I started this project, I originally intended to make it 1, an adult, and 2, a warrior themed harpy. So that's why it's a hawk. But as I was working on it, it slowly just turned cuter and cuter, and I couldn't resist just turning it into a hatchling. So we're going to be making a hatchling harpy. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so I'm going to start on the clay pieces first for our baby harpy. So I'm going to do the head first and then we'll move on to the feet. So normally when I make my clay heads, I start off with a lump of tinfoil. I roughly shape it into the shape that I want the head to be, but slightly smaller. Then I take strips of clay, I start wrapping it around the tinfoil and covering everything up and blending it together to get a basic shape to start with. Since I'm basing my harpy off of an eagle or a hawk, I want to have a hooked beak, so I want to make sure to take that into account when getting my basic shape down. And then once I have my basic shape down, I'm going to mark out roughly where I want different features to be. So mainly just trying to figure out where the beak is going to start, where the nostrils are going to go, where the eyes are going to go, just all the basic features I'm going to roughly mark out. And then normally when I add a feature to the face, I usually start with the eyes. Once in a while I don't, but normally I do. For this art doll, I'm not going to be using glass eyes, I'm just going to be making clay ones. So for that, I'm just going to take some balls of clay, roughly the size that I want the eyes, and I'm going to push them onto the face where I have it marked where I want the eyes to go. I'll roughly mess with them a little bit to kind of flatten them and make sure they're nice and even, and then I'm going to take strips of clay to make the bottom and top eyelid. For this, I'm just going to lay those strips of clay out and then I'm going to blend them into the rest of the face. I'll use my tools to kind of clean up the edges around the eyeball, and then if I want to add any other features or change the shape of it, I'll do it then as well. A good example of this is with the brow of the face. I want to have stick out just slightly, so I added balls of clay there and then I just blended it into everything else that I had. I cleaned everything up and just made sure that it worked well with the face. After that, I'm going to start working on the beak. Now our beak is closed, but I do want to define where the two halves of the beak are meeting. So we will sketch kind of a rough line out, figure out where we want it, and then you'll want to refine it later. So just make sure that you like the layout first. You don't want to go super detailed right away, but once you like it, you can clean those lines up. After that, I'm going to just kind of straighten up the shape of the beak a little bit, mess around with it until I like it, and then we're going to work on the nostrils. For this, I'm going to take a lump of clay, I'm going to make it kind of an oval shape, and I'm going to lay it right where I want the nostrils to go. Once I have that in place, I'm then going to use my tools to make the openings of the nostrils and to clean up my edges. I'm going to clean up the edge, make sure it's nice and smooth around the base of the head, and then I'm going to put this in the oven for about probably 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Now with making the clay feet, I'm not quite sure where it went, but I misplaced some of the footage of starting the piece. So adding the claws to the wire frame, I just don't know where it went, but you can kind of see what I did so far. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to start covering up the wire frame. I'm going to start with the bottoms of the feet, and I'm going to take strips of clay and lay them out on those wires. Where all those clay pieces meet, I am going to blend them together and kind of clean them up a little bit and just make sure that I like the basic look of it. If you want, you can add some wrinkles and stuff, but since these are the bottoms of the feet, if you don't want to add detail to it, you don't have to. Now one thing you'll probably notice with these feet is the back toe is a lot longer than it normally is with birds. And the reason I did that was to actually make it easier for my creature to stand up. Since it's on 2 legs, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to balance the body, and making the legs a little bit more sturdy does help. So after I got the bottoms of the feet done, I did do a pre-bake for about 20 minutes, and then once it was out of the oven and cooled to touch, I started working on the tops of the feet. So the tops of the feet are just going to be layered scales, so I'm just going to take balls of clay that are all roughly about the same size and start layering them on the toes and the top of the foot. I'm going to add a little bit more clay to the very base of the foot, and this is mainly to help me connect it to the body. So this is not going to be anything that's going to be shown, this is going to get covered in fur fabric when we connect everything. So I'm going to add that, I'm going to clean up the edges around it, and then we're going to put these in the oven for one final bake, probably another 45-minute bake at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once our clay pieces are out of the oven and have cooled to touch, we can start painting them. So I'm going to start with the face, and I'm going to actually be primering it in two separate portions. So I'm going to start with primering the beak, and then after we get the beak painted, we'll move on to painting the face. So for the beak, I want it to kind of stand out, so I'm going to start by primering it with a yellow, and then I'm just going to gradually keep painting it yellow and then kind of darken it as I go until I like it. And then after I'm happy with the coloring of the beak, I'm going to move on to painting and primering the face. So remember, we are going to be furring this, so I'm not going to add a ton of detail to this part. So I want my fur fabric to be a brown, so I'm going to use a brown to primer my face. And then I'm also going to be blending this slightly into the color of the beak. So I'm not just going to have a straight line kind of stopping where the beak is and starting where the fur fabric is going to be. I'm going to have it blended slightly to make it look a little bit more natural. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to be painting the eyeballs a black color. I'm not going to add a ton of detail to this, I'm just going to make them a solid black. While I have my black out, I'm also going to add paint to the inside of the nostrils and the creases of the mouth. So I'm just going to add some black there to add some shadowing, and then I'll wipe away any excess paint, or if it dries, I'll just paint over and clean up the edges. After that, I'm going to paint the rest of the nose. I'm just going to take kind of a khaki color and go over the outer portion of the nostrils. Once that's dried, I'm then going to add a small amount of white paint to my brush because I want to do kind of a whitewash. So I'm going to add a little bit of paint and remove most of it, just kind of clean my brush a tiny bit, and then I'm going to go over lightly on top of the clay surface to just kind of catch the paint on whatever is raised up. So this will kind of add a more dusty look to the colors. So that's honestly about it for the painting for the face. For the feet, what we're going to do is we're going to use very similar colors. So I'm going to try and match the bottoms of the feet to the color of the beak. That way everything kind of looks a little bit more cohesive. And then we're going to do the scales kind of a brown, but we want them to stand out from the rest of the body because the body is going to be brown. So I'm going to use kind of a lighter brown. And then I'm also going to kind of like darken it a little bit more by doing a black wash. So it's kind of like the last thing we did with the clay head. We added white over everything. We're going to do the same thing but with black paint. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to be painting the scales on the tops of the feet a nice bright brown, and then we're also going to be painting the claws a black. And then we're going to do one final paint wash over this. We're going to add a little bit of white. So I'm just lightly going over the scales on the tops of the feet with this. With the paint that I did, I'm going to let everything completely dry, and then I'm going to mix up some resin and paint it over my clay pieces to help protect the paint. This resin is going to take about 24 to 48 hours to cure, so while that's going on, we're going to start on the sewing and getting everything else ready. Actually, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start on the feathers and then we'll start on the sewing. So the feathers for my art doll are going to be made out of felt. So I have them all cut out. I've got feathers for the wings and the tail. And then I'm going to be doing 3 layers of felt for each thing. So the way that I cut them, I have larger feathers that gradually get smaller and layer on top of each other. And what we're going to be doing now is we're going to kind of darken everything up a little bit and add some painted details to the feathers. Because leaving them this plain solid color is going to be a little bit unrealistic. So I'm going to start by dampening everything with a little bit of water, and then I'm going to start adding some black paint to the feathers. I'm mainly going to be doing it at the base. I want to leave the tips of the feathers a bit brighter, so I'm going to add black paint to the base of the feathers and let it kind of suck into the felt so it fades from that black to the lighter color that the felt originally was. And then after I have that, I'm going to let them dry. Sometimes this takes a few hours. If you use too much water, it could take maybe 1 or 2 days. But after that, I'm then going to be taking my fabric markers and I'm going to draw on some extra details. The main detail that I'm doing is just adding a few extra lines of colors here and there, and then adding black to the tips of the feathers that I want to stand out. I'm also going to add a few black stripes, but not to every single feather, just the main ones at the very edge. So obviously those are going to have to dry again, but then once they're dried, we can start gluing our layers of felt together. For this, I'm just going to be using some fabric glue. I'm going to layer everything together and then leave it somewhere to dry. Okay, so since we have our feathers done, we can now start on the sewing. I have a few pattern pieces already drawn out, and I'm going to use this to cut my fabric. When we start putting everything together, we'll probably have to make a few extra pieces because I'm not quite sure how it's going to work together until I start assembling it. So right now I have the main body pattern, the leg pattern, and the arm pattern, and each one is going to need a front and a back. So you'll want to make 2 of the body pattern, and then you're going to make a left and a right for each of the legs and each of the arms. For the sewing, what you're going to do is you're going to take the fabric for the legs, you're going to take 1 of each side, and you're going to sew down the front of them. And then we're going to do the same thing with the arms, we're going to sew down one side of those as well, connecting the fabric together. After that, we're going to start putting everything together. So I made a very simple kind of stick figure wire frame, and we're going to add our clay head to this. So I'm going to glue it to the wire for the neck. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to create a pattern for the neck, because I haven't figured that out yet, and now that it's on a wire frame, it's just a little bit easier to figure out. So I sketched that out real quick, and then I cut out my pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 pieces, and I'm going to sew on the top portion of the neck. Once those are sewn together, I'm going to glue it around the base of the head, and then once that glue has dried, I'm going to sew the bottom portion of the neck and stuff the neck. Once we have the neck done, we're going to move on to adding the fabric for the body. So I'm going to adjust this a little bit to compensate for me adding fabric to the neck by just cutting off a little bit of the fabric at the very top, and then I'm going to sew these pieces to the base of the neck. So I'm going to sew 1 to the back of the neck and 1 to the front of the neck. After that, we're going to start working on the wings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the feathers for the wings and the fabric for the arms, and I'm going to sew those closed. And while I'm sewing the arms closed, I'm adding the feathers into place. So I'm going to sew those together, and then we're going to add them to the wire frame and then sew them in place on the body. Once we have those in place, I'm going to sew down the sides of the torso, and I'm going to start stuffing the body a little bit more. Now before we add the legs or work on anything else, I'm going to add the tail. So for the tail, I need to add a little bit of fur fabric around the base of the feathers. I'm going to glue that in place, and then we're going to sew it to the back portion of the body. So for this, I'm going to figure out where I want the tail to go. I'm going to cut a little line, and I'm going to sew the tail feathers in place right there. After that, we're going to start sewing the upper legs. So I'm going to kind of spread my wire frame, and I'm going to sew the inside portion of the legs first. And then I'm going to take the lower leg fabric and I'm going to sew it to the bottom portion of these legs. Once that's in place, we can get a better idea of the length of the legs, we can cut our wires to fit, and then we can add the clay legs to the wire frame. So I'm just going to take a thinner gauge wire and I'm going to wrap these in place on the wire frame. Once those are in place, we're going to take our leg fabric and we're going to start gluing it around the bases of the clay feet. So I'm going to glue it to the front and then wrap it around to the back. You'll want to let that dry a little bit, and then we can start stuffing and closing up the backs of the legs. Or with this one, it's actually more of the side of the legs. Okay, so right now our harpy is all put together, and now we need to clean everything up. So you notice it's really fluffy. If you want, you can leave it this way, but I really want to define the shape of the body by trimming the fur fabric. So I'm just going to figure out where I want the fur fabric to be the fluffiest, and I'm going to try and avoid those areas. So I know I want the back of the harpy to be kind of left alone, but I also want the chest to be left alone as well. And then most of the neck. So honestly, I'm mainly shaving the legs of the harpy and then a little bit of the torso. After that, I decided that I wanted to have scaling going up the leg just a little bit more, so I cut some little pieces of felt and I'm going to layer these going up the leg. For this, I'm just going to use my hot glue gun because it was just a little bit easier to work with. Once I had those in place, I'm going to kind of paint over them to add a bit more detail and to kind of make them look a little bit more natural. So I'm going to add black to the edges and stuff and kind of create a shadowing in between each of the scales. Then I'm going to take that same brown that we used to paint the scales on the clay feet, and I'm going to be painting the scales that are made out of felt with it. So I'm just going to go over those a little bit. I'll probably adjust here and there, and then I actually did kind of a whitewash on this as well, painting up the front of the legs just a little bit. And then lastly, we need to add some fur fabric to the face. So I'm going to take my fabric glue again, kind of lay it out where I want the fabric to stick to, and I'm going to take some fur trimmings and just kind of sprinkle it over the glue, and then use my tools to clean it up and just move it around until it's nice and smooth and doesn't look all clumpy. I recommend if you're going to fur the face this way that you want to wait until the glue has dried and then brush away any fur that hasn't stuck to it, and then if you have any bald spots, you can redo them. Okay guys, and this is my little Harpy hatchling. I had so much fun making it. Came out really cute. Obviously, because I decided to switch it to a hatchling. I do want to try and make another harpy, maybe pick a really weird bird for a harpy to be based off of, like a peacock or something. I don't know, but I think that would be really cool to pick just a very strange bird and turn it into a harpy. And this time around, I think I will probably make an adult, but if it comes out really, really cute, it will be a hatchling, because I can't help myself. Anyways, I'm gonna have this little guy in my Etsy shop, so if anyone wants to buy him and give him a new home, I'll leave the links down below. I also have links to all the materials that I like to use to make my art dolls, and these are affiliated links, so they will help support the channel if you want to buy anything through them. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!